American government, foreign policy. When Americans think of national security, they tend to think in terms of military threats. But national security is also a question of maintaining a nation's way of life. Increasingly, we've asked that question in the context of international trade. Many of the goods that we buy today come from abroad. Every day, about 8 million shipping containers arrive in the United States from other countries, carrying everything from the mundane, clothes, novelties, toys, to the vital, computers, food, and even critical military supplies. That globalized trade economy, product of our relative position of strength after the Second World War, has turned out to be both a critical challenge and an incredible opportunity for the people of the United States. The United States has an important comparative advantage over every other nation on the planet as a result of the use of the American dollar as the world reserve currency. The dollar is the general world currency, among others in the basket, but it comprises the biggest percentage. We have an incredibly profitable internet technology sector in the United States, and we have the most advanced agricultural sector in the world. Through international trade, these two sectors in particular have powered millions of American jobs and enabled immeasurable human growth and development the world over. But we also have comparative disadvantages that come along with these strengths. The wage scale in the United States is much higher than in countries like China, India, and Mexico. Well, this can be a good thing. Compare what it means to be below the poverty line in Jakarta, with New York City, for instance. It also means that goods can reliably be produced more cheaply abroad, which has driven outsourcing of American labor for nearly 3 decades. That's good for consumers. We pay less for the goods that we buy as a result, but it also means that millions of American jobs have gradually been lost to foreign companies overseas or domestic companies who offshore those jobs. By proxy, our outsourcing has led to incredible economic booms elsewhere around the world. We can't forget that dimension of it. U.S. foreign policy is rooted in what's called the national interest, the conditions necessary to protect American security and general well-being, the national interest. President Dwight D. Eisenhower described the national interest as well as anyone. He said, "We do not keep security establishments merely to defend property or territory or rights abroad or at sea. We keep the security forces to defend a way of life, an American way of life." Diplomacy and national defense undeniably fit into America's foreign policy. But there's another aspect of foreign policy that's been even more important since the end of the Second World War. It's critical that we concentrate on foreign trade and examine America's emergence as a global economic power in order to underscore the important connection between trade and national security. At the end of the Second World War, the United States was the world's strongest military power and also its strongest economic power. Large parts of Europe and Asia had been devastated by the war, obviously, whereas America's manufacturing sectors were intact and had not been bombed. The U.S. economy was generating half of the world's goods and services, and the American dollar had replaced the British pound as the leading international currency or world reserve currency. The U.S. took the lead in helping to rebuild Western Europe and Japan, deliberately aligning such regions with American interests over the interests of America's chief rival, the USSR or Soviet Union. The most ambitious effort in the early years was the Marshall Plan, which provided more than $200 billion in today's dollars for European reconstruction. When the Marshall Plan concluded in 1952, the economy of every European country was back on better footing. That situation was a godsend for U.S. companies. As European countries recovered from the devastation of the war, so did their demand for American-made goods. We helped bring Europe back from the brink, and Europe became our chief customer. American investors were also active participants in the war recovery effort. Before the war, they concentrated on domestic projects, but after the war, they looked overseas as well, including the oil-rich Middle East countries. Arab states needed capital and technical know-how to open new oil fields, and American oilmen, who had been innovating their drilling practices all along the American South and Southwest, were happy to oblige. Underlying all of these activities was a shared conviction among U.S. policymakers that a healthy, growing global economy would be a key to America's future security. International trade, it was believed, would make nations mutually dependent with one another, diminishing the likelihood that they would resort to conflict as they had in World War I and World War II. If goods could cross borders freely, it was thought tanks would not. America's economic vitality was also a key to containing Soviet expansionism during the nuclear arms race. After World War II, the Soviet Union had orchestrated communist takeovers in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and other countries in Eastern Europe that it had stationed troops in during wartime. Over these nations fell the Iron Curtain, dividing East from West, communism, capitalism. President Harry S. Truman, who assumed office after FDR died in office and then won re-election himself in 1944, responded with a policy of containment in the first years after the war. Containment. The West, or Western countries, led by the United States, would contest Soviet expansionism at every turn and seek to stop communism's advance wherever it now encroached. Military power was a part of that strategy. In 1949, the United States took the lead in creating the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, NATO, a defense alliance that included 10 Western European countries and Canada and the US. NATO's first Secretary General said that the alliance was formed to keep Russians out and Americans in. Americans were indeed in Europe. 300,000 US troops were now permanently stationed there. Whereas the United States had fully demobilized after World War I, it did not do so after World War II, maintaining a large military establishment and a permanently high level of defense spending and military support apparatus all around the globe. Today, the United States spends far more on defense than any other nation, more than 3 times that of China, the next highest spender, comprising 40% of all total global defense spending. Containment policy also aimed at keeping the Soviet Union out of the global economy. The Soviet economy would be marginalized, denied access to Western dollars and capital technology markets. In the long run, that proved decisive. When the Soviet Union collapsed from within, starting about 1991, it did so largely because its economy was in shambles. It could not maintain military investments to keep up with the US and simultaneously manage the social needs of their people. Indeed, their planned socialist economy required that they try to do both. America's post-war strategy also included financial support for developing nations. The US took the lead in forming and funding the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, which makes short-term loans to countries experiencing economic problems, as well as the World Bank, which makes long-term development loans to countries for capital investment projects such as dams, highways, and factories. These financial instruments, along with direct U.S. aid and investment, were aimed at helping developing countries expand their economies, which would increase the demand for goods made in the United States and elsewhere, and help realize a safer world for all, founded in capitalism, not in socialism. In these various actions, the United States had acted in a way that no other conquering power had in world history. Rather than seizing the territory of its defeated enemies, it helped them rebuild. It made them its customers. Perhaps nothing is more symbolic of this trend than the black market exchange of Michael Jackson cassette tapes and blue jeans and other Western goods across the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, and eventually the introduction of McDonald's into Moscow after the Cold War's end. Certainly, the imposition of America's new, modern type of foreign policy was not without its darker chapters. In the early 1950s, in Iran and Guatemala, the United States helped sponsor coups that replaced elected leaders with military dictators. In each case, the coup came at the request of certain business interests who traded with the United States, an oil consortium in Iran, and a United Fruit Company in Guatemala. By the 1950s, Americans were in the midst of a period of sustained growth and prosperity. U.S. firms were still producing more than 40% of the world's total goods and services. Good-paying jobs were plentiful in the United States. Nevertheless, America's post-war economic position was unsustainable. As the European and Japanese economies re-strengthened, they increasingly looked to sell their goods in foreign markets. They weren't just buyers any longer. By 1960, Germany, the aggressor of World War II, accounted now for a sixth of industrial national manufacturing output on the world stage. Japan's productivity was lower, but by 1970, it was accounting for an eighth of the output. In other words, America's trading partners were clearly becoming its trading rivals. By the early 1970s, global wealth had rebalanced. The United States balance of trade had leveled out some. 2/3 of gold held by the U.S. Treasury had been traded out for dollars. Each year since, the United States has had a negative balance of trade, consuming more goods from abroad than it ships overseas. The 1970s were also a tipping point in other ways. As the Vietnam War, a proxy war with the Soviet Union, dragged on, the limits of U.S. military power had become clear to everyone across the world. The Korean War, 2 decades before, had ended in a stalemate, and Vietnam would end in an American defeat. President Richard Nixon declared that the United States would no longer act as the free world's lone ranger, fighting localized wars to contain communist threats that pose no immediate danger to America's security. Instead, Nixon sought to reduce tensions with the Soviet Union. Nixon initiated the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, which resulted in cutbacks in both the United States and Soviet nuclear weapon arsenals. In 1972, Nixon visited the People's Republic of China, the first official contact with that country since the communists seized power in 1949. The Vietnam War also contributed to a major change in U.S. economic policy. The war had produced budget deficits and fueled an existing inflationary and even stagflationary spiral, prompting President Nixon to end the direct convertibility of dollars for U.S.-owned gold reserves. Up until that point, any country could demand gold for the U.S. dollars that had accumulated through trade with the United States. By taking us off the gold standard, the United States would not face that burden given the depreciating dollar. The price of the dollar would now be determined by its relative value to other currencies. Its value would float, going up or down depending on the strength of the nation's economy and the confidence in the government. Given the dollar's continuing position as the world's leading currency, the short-term advantages of letting it float outweighed the short-term consequences of maintaining its fixed peg to the value of gold, i.e. $32 per ounce of gold. U.S. policymakers believed that they didn't have to worry that other nations would refuse to accept our dollars, since they were in demand everywhere seemingly, particularly since Saudi Arabia and the cartel of oil and petroleum exporting countries, OPEC, had agreed to use the American dollar for all its oil transactions. We removed the gold standard but moved to a petrodollar system. As long as most oil deals were done in dollars, there would be an international demand for the dollar. Moreover, it was believed breaking the gold peg and issuing fiat notes by decree would afford the U.S. flexibility during economic downturns, since we would be free to pump paper money into the economy without really worrying that it would later drain the nation's gold reserves. In addition, proponents suggested that devaluation of the dollar would help offer a way to improve the balance of trade with other countries. When the dollar depreciates, it drops in value relative to other currencies, which means that goods made in America are less expensive abroad. By the 1980s, the American and world economies had changed fundamentally from what they were in the years immediately following World War II. There was vastly more market competition between nations, and business practices had evolved. Businesses had become international players in their own right. Changes in communication and transportation, think telephones, fax machines, even early computers, had made it easier for them to conduct operations without regard for national borders. The firm could be headquartered in New York with its factories in Thailand, giving it the best of both worlds: access to management and finance in New York, the United States, and access to low-wage workers in Thailand. Why pay high wages to American workers when the same goods could be produced less expensively abroad and shipped back to the U.S. markets and still make more money? It was believed a weaker dollar would help ensure more labor stayed on American shores. An obstacle to the success of this production strategy was tariffs. Tariffs are taxes imposed on imported goods. High tariffs on goods produced abroad could wipe out the savings made from making products overseas. America's multinational corporations began to pressure lawmakers to adopt free trade agreements to get rid of existing tariffs. The idea that the reduction or elimination of barriers to trade would be best for all. They found a rhetorical ally in Republican President Ronald Reagan, a true believer in free markets. Developments elsewhere also added to the momentum behind free trade. European nations were on the path to economic integration, passport-free Europe, i.e. the EU, with few tariffs on trade. As a result, trade between European countries was increasing, with American products being squeezed out because they were more expensive than the international ones. Upon taking office in 1989, President George H.W. Bush committed to negotiating a trade agreement that would serve as America's answer to an integrating Europe. It's called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. It's a trade compact involving the United States, Canada, and Mexico. NAFTA would result in the immediate elimination of a wide range of tariffs between those nations immediately, and the gradual elimination of all the rest over time. Bush lacked the authority to implement NAFTA on his own. Congress has constitutional authority over tariffs and commerce with other nations, look in the Constitution. So it would have to approve the agreement. This was not a sure thing. Free trade can look different to a member of Congress, whose districts would be uniquely impacted or could be uniquely impacted, than it does to the president. From a White House perspective, freeing up trade between nations is the winning formula in that it's likely to boost economic growth, drive long-term innovation, and lower prices. To members of Congress, on the other hand, support of freer trade is often a question of its impact on their constituency. Although most members of Congress say they support free trade in principle, as capitalists, they frequently back away from those principles when confronted with an actual trade agreement that might result in some people losing their jobs in the short term in their district. If the agreement will harm a major interest in their district or state, they often resort to protectionism, the use of tariffs or other trade barriers to protect the domestic company from foreign competition. As it happened, President Bush was no longer in office when NAFTA came up for a vote in Congress. Bill Clinton had won in 1992. He lost his bid for a second presidential term. That complicated the issue further. We had a bill sort of passing between presidents now. With their ties to business, Republican lawmakers have tended to be stronger advocates for free trade. Democratic lawmakers tend to be less supportive because of their ties to labor groups, which often regard free trade and outsourcing as a threat to jobs and dues payers. Organized labor had come out strongly against NAFTA, believing that American jobs would quickly be lost to lower-paid Mexican workers just across the border. Labor groups threatened to withhold election support from any Democratic lawmakers who backed NAFTA. Environmental groups, another Democratic constituency, were also opposed, citing Mexico's weaker environmental regulation laws. Nevertheless, after studying the issue, Clinton came out in favor of NAFTA as a Democrat, concluding that it would foster economic growth in the long term. Said Clinton, "NAFTA means jobs, American jobs and good-paying American jobs. I didn't believe that. I would not support this agreement." Clinton's support was crucial. If Clinton, instead of rallying Democratic members of Congress to support the bill, had vigorously opposed it, it might have been defeated in Congress. And even if it had passed, Clinton could have vetoed it. When NAFTA was voted on in Congress in 1993, it had overwhelming Republican support in both chambers and enough support from the Democratic majority in each chamber to pass easily. NAFTA was replaced with a similar free trade pact in 2020, signed by a president more protectionist than free trade advocate. In 2017, in one of his first acts as president, Donald Trump killed a free trade agreement that had been negotiated by the Obama administration. It would have created a trading partnership involving the United States and 10 other countries bordering the Pacific. Trump, who famously ran as a populist Republican, claimed the agreement would result in huge job and manufacturing losses. Opponents focused on an important counter-argument, one based on national security, for why they viewed Trump's action as a mistake. The free trade agreement would have linked the United States more closely with a number of Asian countries, helping to offset China's growing presence in that region. Hopefully you're seeing now how trade policy, economic policy, and military policy interact or complement one another or could contradict each other. In the past 2 decades, China has greatly expanded its economic reach across the globe, including sponsoring infrastructure and commercial projects in Asian and African countries for the purpose of drawing them into its sphere of influence. To a lesser extent, China has been pursuing the same strategy in South America and in the Middle East. The relationship between the People's Republic of China and the United States of America is incredibly complex. The American and Chinese economies are closely tied. China accounts for nearly a fifth of all U.S. trade. Roughly 85% of that trade consists of imports from China. Only 15% of that trade is accounted for U.S. exports to China. That trade imbalance has existed for years, with the effect that China now holds more than $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds, second only to Japan. China's growing wealth has enabled it to enlarge its navy. It was structured to protect China's territorial waters, but is being reconfigured to operate throughout the Pacific Ocean now. In recent years, China has aggressively pursued claims to islands held by Japan, Vietnam, and the Philippines. China has pointedly refused to recognize international laws governing the oceans and has laid claim to waters far beyond its coastline. China's claim is set forth in the so-called 9-dash line, which runs down the full length of Vietnam nearly to Malaysia and then back up past the Philippines. In recent years, China has taken steps to tighten its grip on Hong Kong and Taiwan to much international outcry. In response to China's actions, the United States has enlarged its Pacific fleet and is pursuing mutual defense treaties with nations in the Pacific. Nevertheless, it's unclear whether a serious provocation by China would be met with a forceful response from the United States. That option seems almost unthinkable given the importance of China to the U.S. economy. Indeed, we rely heavily on Chinese-made weapons and materials. How can we fight an enemy who controls our means of production? Most strategists believe it unlikely that China or other rising powers want to start a fight with the United States. Though its Navy is expanding, it's still vastly overmatched by the U.S. Navy, although the gap is shrinking. China's growing use of military and economic power is very reminiscent of the path the United States followed after World War II, when it leveraged its military and economic power to reshape the world in ways to its liking. Trade has been seen as a useful alternative to war and conflict. When it opened itself up to world markets, China unleashed massive economic growth that has brought it to the position it holds today. Rather than being blocked by the West, China has been asked to be a full partner in the international community. It has been granted a seat on the United Nations Security Council and has been admitted to the World Trade Organization, WTO. China went from a nation of farmers to an urbanizing power in 2 generations with the help of the international community in the West. But today, that balanced world order I've described is being shaken. On February 24th, 2022, President's Day, Russian President Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, single-handedly reigniting the Cold War. My immediate thought was of China and the fear that blood was now in the water. But the world now understands, in a way that most Americans do not, that the United States has gradually placed itself in a position of extreme vulnerability through short-sighted policy decisions for generations now. 80 years after Adolf Hitler's bunker suicide and 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the conflicts of the 20th century suddenly roared back into the American consciousness. After our shortcomings in Vietnam, in Iraq, and Afghanistan, is our American foreign policy robust enough to withstand such a colossal test of resolve? Have America's debts, differences, and declines left her less strength to respond without overreaction? We are now witness to an incredible effort to ostracize Russia from the Western world. The same Russia who supplies much of Europe and Asia with its wheat, its precious metals, and its gas, its natural gas and oil. No peace has yet been reached at the time of this recording, and the threat of nuclear war, powered by hypersonic missiles, hangs over this moment like an overcast sky. If this conflict is to end peacefully, America will be provided once again with an opportunity to learn from its mistakes, course correct its foreign, fiscal, and monetary policies. Please choose and vote wisely.